Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen is a classic novel set in the early 19th century in England. The story primarily revolves around the Bennet family, especially the second eldest daughter, Elizabeth Bennet, and her tumultuous relationship with Mr. Fitzwilliam Darcy. The novel explores themes of love, class, social expectations, and personal growth. The novel begins with the introduction of the Bennet family, consisting of Mr. and Mrs. Bennet and their 5 daughters, Jane, Elizabeth, Mary, Catherine, Kitty, and Lydia. The Bennets live in Longbourn, a small estate with an entailed property, meaning it cannot be inherited by daughters, and the family's financial future is uncertain. The arrival of Mr. Charles Bingley, a wealthy and eligible bachelor, in the neighborhood creates quite a stir in the Bennet family. Mrs. Bennet is determined to marry one of her daughters to Mr. Bingley, whom she believes is a perfect match for Jane, the eldest Bennet daughter. Mr. Bingley is amiable and quickly takes an interest in Jane, while his friend Mr. Darcy is reserved and aloof. At the first local ball, Jane and Mr. Bingley become attracted to each other, but Mr. Darcy's pride leads him to snub Elizabeth, referring to her as tolerable but not handsome enough to tempt him. This remark offends Elizabeth, and she forms a strong prejudice against Mr. Darcy. The novel introduces several other characters, including Mr. and Mrs. Bennet's cousin, Mr. Collins, who is set to inherit the Bennet estate due to the entailment. Mr. Collins is a pompous and obsequious clergyman who comes to Longbourn with the intention of marrying one of the Bennet daughters. He eventually proposes to Elizabeth, who firmly declines his proposal, much to her mother's dismay. Meanwhile, Jane is invited to Netherfield, Mr. Bingley's rented estate, after falling ill on a visit there. Mrs. Bennet hopes this will lead to an engagement between Jane and Mr. Bingley, but Jane's illness keeps her at Netherfield longer than expected. During this time, Elizabeth visits her sister and becomes better acquainted with Mr. Darcy, whom she still dislikes. However, Mr. Darcy becomes increasingly attracted to Elizabeth's wit and intelligence. Back at Longbourn, the youngest Bennet sisters, Kitty and Lydia, are excited about the arrival of a regiment of soldiers in a nearby town. Their frivolous behavior and obsession with the officers, especially Mr. George Wickham, a charming officer with a hidden agenda, cause distress to their family. Mr. Collins turns his attentions to Elizabeth's close friend, Charlotte Lucas, and proposes to her. Charlotte, realizing that she is unlikely to receive another offer of marriage, accepts Mr. Collins's proposal, which shocks Elizabeth. At a ball in Meryton, Mr. Bingley and Mr. Darcy return. Mr. Bingley resumes his attentions to Jane, and Mr. Darcy continues to pursue Elizabeth. Mr. Darcy eventually proposes to Elizabeth, declaring his love for her. However, he also admits that he has struggled with his feelings for her due to her lower social standing and her family's lack of propriety. Elizabeth is shocked and rejects his proposal vehemently, accusing him of wronging Mr. Wickham and causing trouble between Mr. Bingley and Jane. Mr. Darcy leaves, and Elizabeth is left to contemplate her feelings and the events that have transpired. As time passes, Elizabeth visits Charlotte and Mr. Collins at their home in the village of Hunsford. There, she meets Lady Catherine de Bourgh, Mr. Darcy's haughty and overbearing aunt. Lady Catherine is curious about Elizabeth's relationship with Mr. Darcy and tries to dissuade her from pursuing him. Elizabeth remains independent-minded and refuses to be intimidated. During her stay at Hunsford, Elizabeth is surprised to encounter Mr. Darcy again. He is visiting his aunt, Lady Catherine, and their paths cross frequently. Despite her initial hostility, Elizabeth observes a change in Mr. Darcy's behavior. He becomes more courteous and considerate, and they engage in intellectual conversations. At the same time, Elizabeth receives distressing news from home. Lydia has eloped with Mr. Wickham, and they are nowhere to be found. The Bennet family is devastated by the scandal, as Lydia's actions threaten to ruin their reputations. Mr. Darcy, realizing that Lydia's reputation and her family's honor are at stake, takes it upon himself to locate Lydia and Mr. Wickham. He succeeds in finding them and arranges for their marriage, using his influence to secure Wickham's cooperation. This act of kindness and responsibility impresses Elizabeth, and she begins to reconsider her feelings toward Mr. Darcy. Upon her return to Longbourn, Elizabeth receives a letter from Jane, informing her of Lydia's marriage. Jane also mentions that Mr. Bingley has returned to Netherfield, and his attentions to her have resumed. This news brings hope to the Bennet family, as they believe that Jane and Mr. Bingley may finally become engaged. Elizabeth's relationship with Mr. Darcy becomes more cordial and complex. They have meaningful conversations, and Elizabeth gradually realizes that she has misjudged him. She also learns about the true nature of Mr. Wickham's character and Mr. Darcy's role in trying to protect the Bennet family's reputation. During a visit to Pemberley, Mr. Darcy's grand estate, Elizabeth is further impressed by his wealth and good character. She meets his sister, Georgiana, and observes the warmth and respect with which he treats his staff and tenants. All of these observations deepen Elizabeth's feelings for him. Unfortunately, their growing closeness is interrupted by a visit from Mr. Darcy's aunt, Lady Catherine, who strongly disapproves of Mr. Darcy marrying Elizabeth and tries to intimidate her into refusing his proposal. Elizabeth refuses to yield to Lady Catherine's demands and returns to Longbourn determined to accept Mr. Darcy's proposal if he were to renew it. Upon her return, Elizabeth is met with the shocking news that Mr. Bingley has proposed to Jane, and she has accepted. This joyful development is followed by Mr. Darcy's unexpected return. He proposes to Elizabeth once more, expressing his enduring love for her. This time, Elizabeth accepts his proposal, and they become engaged. The novel concludes with the marriage of Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy, as well as Jane and Mr. Bingley. The marriages of the Bennet sisters bring happiness and security to the family, and the novel ends on a note of joy and optimism. Pride and Prejudice is a timeless novel that explores the complexities of human relationships, the consequences of pride and prejudice, and the transformative power of self-reflection and personal growth. It remains a beloved work of literature, celebrated for its wit, character development, and social commentary.